Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Drill Mason, aka Jay Mason. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Album Cover, where we get inside the entertainment industry with those in the know and give them their flowers while they're here to be celebrated. With me right now, I have an entertainment writer for the contending. He's interviewed luminaries in and around the entertainment industry. He's currently in the home of the Fighting Irish, South Bend, Indiana. Rudy. And we're gonna get into music, sports, NIL, all that, and then some with the one, the only, the incomparable David E. Phillips. Welcome to Beyond the Album Cover, sir. And it's first time, long time. We've been Facebook friends for a minute, but it's first time virtually we've actually been able to connect.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And the truth of the matter is I didn't know you did this. And if I had, we probably would have done this a lot sooner.
Better late than never, right?
Better late than never. You're absolutely right.
All right, so let's just go ahead and just jump into it. Where were you born, and how did you end up getting into the business of entertainment writing?
Yeah, so I spent most of my life in the Midwestern patch. I was born in Kentucky. I lived there for 4 years, went back consistently. But then we moved to a very, very small town in Michigan, Niles, Michigan. But Niles borders with Indiana, and South Bend is just over that border. And so that is the place that I have called home for the last 20 years, I suppose, but my K through 12 was done through yeah, actually my K through 12 in college was done through through the state of Michigan.
Okay, now you mentioned where you were from in Michigan is close to South Bend, Indiana. Now, in terms of the Midwest popularity with basketball, is pretty much
Ah,
is equivalent to Friday Night Lights down in Texas, Florida, or any football-rich state. So can you just explain for our audience just how seriously basketball is taken in the Midwest?
basketball I think is particular. I mean, Michigan, football comes first in Michigan, at the University of Michigan, I should say. Michigan State, I think basketball comes first. In Indiana and Kentucky, obviously basketball comes first. I go back to my roots. I'm a hardcore Wildcat fan, which hasn't made my life the easiest over the last decade or so. But yeah, if you are, it's interesting how you can be in the state of Kentucky, and Louisville, which is in the state of Kentucky, obviously, is your mortal enemy if you're a Lexington person, and vice versa, right? And then the Michigan, Indiana aspect is also like mortal enemies too. Indiana, Michigan, maybe a little less so, but there's a part of that too. So yeah, I mean, and then of course when you come to football, Notre Dame, it's like you live in two different cities when you live in Notre Dame. You live in the city during non-football season, and you live in the city during football season. And you can actually see, I'll give you an example. The year of the Reggie Bush push, uh, the population of South Bend, Indiana, which a lot of people don't even know that Notre Dame is a part of, it was doubled in size. You couldn't get a hotel during that USC and Notre Dame game. So I have been surrounded by sort of sports mania in those three spaces for a long time.
Yeah, I remember that infamous Bush push game. I was a sophomore in college. I think Brady Quinn was Notre Dame's quarterback.
Yep.
You had Jeff Shamarger, who later went on to go play baseball with the Cubs, was tight end. And I hated USC at the time, but looking back in hindsight, those were great USC teams. And I still contest that '06 Rose Bowl between USC and Texas, best college football game I've ever seen live on TV. It was Keith Jackson's final call for
Oh,
doing
that's right.
football for ABC Sports, and Vince Young pretty much put Texas on his
Yep.
back and carried them to a national championship. Although Texas did make a run in the college football playoff the past two seasons, they
Mhm.
still have yet to win a title, and the Irish made a run to, I believe it was the title game this past season where they
Yeah.
lost to the Ohio State University.
And I think what happens to Notre Dame, because we've seen this before under the previous administration, is that because they have such a control over their schedule and so forth, they tend to get exposed when they get to the highest level of college football. They have very, very good teams, but the SEC and other. I mean, a mid-grade SEC team is probably nearly as good as a Notre Dame team. Yeah.
Yeah, because when we look at Notre Dame, they're a legacy brand just like Sears and
Yep.
Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, or insert
Absolutely.
here any out of business department store that no longer exists because Notre Dame was getting recruits from all over the country because they were the only game in town on radio. They struck their own deal with NBC, I believe, 93, where it still stands to this day, and they're part-time members of the ACC in all other sports with the exception of football because football rules the roost and they don't have to share the revenue from football with all the other members of the ACC. So,
And
what's your take on name, image, and likeness and how college students now have the power to say, hey, we're going to make money off our name, image, and likeness, where schools have been doing that for years, decades, under the guise of amateurism. And now we're saying enough.
what I would say about Notre Dame is twofold. One is, as I mentioned, people don't. I am always astounded by the number of people who don't know that Notre Dame is in South Bend, and it's because it's like the Vatican in Rome, to be perfectly honest. And there are times like I give you an example. The Notre Dame library, where they sell books and sell apparel and so forth, is available to the public. However, you only get 15 minutes to park there before you can get ticketed. And so, and so there's this sort of moat and drawbridge kind of thing, where Notre Dame is sort of separated from the rest of the town of South Bend, which I'm personally not a fan of. But at the same time, Notre Dame, it brings great benefits to South Bend in terms of employment and so forth. I would say that, when I think of the way that universities have, and this is beyond Notre Dame, have taken advantage of athletes who play for them. I will go back to a different university, University of Michigan, and Chris Webber, and he probably wasn't the first person to say this, but he was the first person I remember saying this, is even if they give me a scholarship to go play basketball for them. And let's face it, scholarship athletes, they are there to play their sport. They're not really there to learn most of the time. That is a fallacy. It's big business. Um, and Chris Webber's point was, and obviously him and Jalen and Jawan got all caught up in, and then their statistics have been removed from the record books of Michigan, which is nonsense, but whatever. But Chris Webber had a really good point. He said, how is it that in the Ann Arbor bookstore, you get to sell get to sell a shirt, a jersey with my name on the back of it, and I get nothing? And I think that applies not only to a lot of modern universities, to modern times, but certainly to Notre Dame as well. If you are a star athlete, look, there's been some progress. The transfer portal, I think, is progress. I think there's some other things that the NCAA has made progress on, but the truth of the matter is, college sports, especially for the big three sports, football, baseball, and basketball, they're semi-pro. And to say anything else is just to be dishonest.
Yeah, it's a de facto minor league system, farm system for the professionals. Say, hey, we want this guy, prep him, and he's going to come to us fully seasoned and ready. And then when we look at how the coaches now are having to hire GMs for the schools, the athletic directors. to pretty much treat it as if you're a semi-pro franchise, where the transfer portal is pretty much college version of free agency.
And which I think is completely fair because a lot of the university the players who go to a university, they go on the basis of the coach. That is their big draw. I want to play for Calipari. I want to play for, oh gosh, name Nick Saban when he was at Alabama. I mean, name the coach, they want to go play for that person. And that person can leave anytime they want. The breaking of contracts, I mean, what was it? Les Miles, told his student athletes on the plane, I believe this when he was still LSU, that I'm not going anywhere. And by the time he touched down, he had a new contract with a different university.
Mhm.
So this idea that the adults should have greater rights than the student athletes who were recruited by that adult well, it's bullshit, is what it is.
Yeah, and then the only thing missing was just the Mayflower trucks and finding out where you're going once you get to a certain meeting point. Look up the 1984 move from Baltimore to Indianapolis. That was what
Oh,
the Colts did, where when
middle of the night.
yeah,
Yeah.
they treated Baltimore like a one night stand, and it
Mhm.
wasn't until when the former Browns, when Art Modell couldn't get a new stadium built in Cleveland, he said, "Fine, I'm going to take my ball, go to Baltimore," and that's how they got the Ravens.
And to talk about that, I mean, you think about these millionaires and, well, actually billionaires who own these stadiums who expect tax dollars to come from the city that they're operating in to pay for their stadiums. Um, you know, there's studies on this. It doesn't actually pay the city back. It's obnoxious almost, this idea that people with all of this money. I'm a Cincinnati Reds fan, which God knows is a long-suffering experience. But I'm looking at the guy who owns the team, and he has millions upon billions of dollars, and he's saying we can't afford a salary for our team that makes us competitive. That is completely nonsense. So I think what we see here in sports that is very, very common is how can the person at the top of the perch get free money?
Mhm.
And I think when we look at this in terms of a labor versus ownership thing, which expands far out beyond sports,
Mhm.
um, there is this tendency for the average person to think, oh, these players get paid all this money to dribble a ball or shoot a ball or throw a ball or whatever you want to say, and they leave out the whole idea that the person who is the by far the richest involved which is at the ownership level, is taking your tax dollars to keep your team in your city. And that is something that I struggle with how people miss on that.
Yeah, you mentioned the Cincinnati Reds. So I'm sure you're probably a fan during the era of the Big Red Machine with Johnny Bench and those guys. And just recently, Charlie Hustle, aka Pete Rose, passed away. And of course, we all know what happened with Pete Rose. And seeing how now sports betting is pretty much almost American as apple pie now, with striking down
Yeah.
PAPSA, I believe it was 2017, 2018, where PAPSA got struck down, which opened up the floodgates for sports betting here in the States, and how these professional leagues are like, hey, we've been missing revenue by not
Yep.
getting in bed with all of these bookmakers, where it's been the standard status quo over in Europe for decades. Now, on that question relating to Pete Rose, do you
Yep.
think posthumously Pete Rose will get inducted into Cooperstown, or
No,
still no?
I don't think he will. I could be wrong about this. I don't think he will, and I don't care if he does. And let me explain why. One, I don't think it's comparable to Joe Jackson. Joe Jackson was illiterate. Joe Jackson from all standpoints, played his heart out in the World Series. He hit the only home run in in that World Series for the Black Sox in 1919, which was against the Cincinnati Reds, by the way. He had the highest batting average of the World Series. If he was dogging it, it wasn't obvious. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is I know that the argument for Pete is that there's no proof that he betted as a player. And I will accept that. There is proof that he betted that he was betting as a manager. Now, people will say that he always betted his team to win as sort of an excuse for his transgression, right? But here's the problem with that. When you are influenced by your own needs, not just to win, but to gain money, you make decisions as a manager that affect not only the outcome of the game potentially, but what goes on with your players. Let me give you an example. Say you've pitched your best middle reliever 3 days in a row, okay? And he really needs rest. Maybe you don't do that on that fourth game if you're down 3-2. Maybe you put him in that game and you put his physical health at risk. Maybe you play a guy who's got a sore hamstring because you've got money on that game. So the idea that what Rose did is a low-level crime is not something I agree with. Now, that being said, with the embrace of gambling among the major leagues and the other major sports, that is what makes Pete's crime look lower level. I will also say Pete Rose is has a if you really go into his biography, not the best person in the world, not the best most sympathetic person in the world. So maybe that's coloring my opinion a little bit.
Mm.
But I would say if he gets in, I'm fine with that. If he doesn't get in, I'm fine with that too.
Right, and referring to Joe Jackson earlier, I believe that's shoeless Joe Jackson. Look at the movie Eight
Shoeless.
Man Out
Yep.
if you want to get more context of that.
Wonderful movie. Yeah.
Yeah. I will watch the movie, but can't watch a baseball game. Baseball for me, I'm sorry, it's like watching paint dry. My granddad used to watch the Super Station TBS, Braves, WGN, Cubs. Try to watch a game. Nope. I will go to a minor league game, but professional, I'm
Hey,
sorry, baseball fans.
I get it. There is something about the slow, intricate space of baseball that reduces my heart rate and my pulse rate that I find useful to me as a human being.
Yeah,
But I'm also a b-ball fan. I moved away from football for a long time, but
mm,
basketball obviously is high octane, and I have I grew up a Sixers fan because. Um, at the age that I was, Dr. J was the coolest thing walking. So it didn't really matter. The Detroit Pistons had Bob Lanier, but they weren't really a factor. I just looked at this guy with this amazing leaping ability and this extraordinary creativity, and he made the greatest shot I've ever seen of all time against the Lakers in the finals. And I always just I mean, I'm a lover of The Fish That Saved Pittsburgh, which is a pretty awful movie, but I will watch it on repeat for comfort. So there you go.
yeah, cult classic and had Dr. J, James Bond, who later went on to play Monroe in School Days,
Yep.
directed the cult classic Death by Temptation. I believe Stockard Channing was
Dr.
in
Channing,
that
yep.
movie,
Oscar
and
nominee. Yep.
Julius Carey, who later went on to play Sho'nuff in The
Yep.
Last Dragon, was in that movie. Meadowlark Lemon, Harlem
Yep.
Globetrotter was in that
Kareem.
movie. Definitely a cult classic. Check that movie out. And when you think about the NBA and you mentioned Dr. J and how when he went from the ABA to the NBA when the ABA got
Mhm.
absolved
Right.
into the NBA, the Spurs, the Nuggets, the Nets, and I believe Pacers, and I think it was one or two other teams from the ABA that ended up getting absolved into
Right.
the NBA as a part of the 76 ABA NBA merger, but it's blanking. But when you kind of think of Dr. J when he came in, and then you had, I believe it was 3 years later, Magic. came into the
And Bird.
league right
Yep. Next
around that
Bird.
time frame. And Bird, now with Bird originally was drafted by the Celtics, I believe, a year prior, but he decided to go back to school.
Right.
And it was when
Retain the
teams could
rights.
still hold on to the rights.
Yep.
And Red Auerbach, being the clever, sneaky man that he was firing a victory stogie and saying, Larry, come on up to Beantown. And a year later, Larry came to Boston and we had the Lakers Celtics rivalry where those two teams pretty much dominated a full decade, where with the exception of the 83 76ers and the 89 Pistons in their first of back-to-back titles, that it was either Lakers Celtics finals.
If you would allow me 3 points on that.
Go
One
ahead.
one is that I think Doc going to the ABA and the lack of film that exists on ABA games, I think has not irrevocably hurt his reputation as one of the greatest players ever. But I think it has somewhat diminished what I mean, there's this great photograph that I've seen of Doc as a high school player going just playing a pickup game, and there are people who are on buildings watching him play from afar because you couldn't get that close. I think it's sort of like how Wilt's 100-point game is not on is has never been filmed. Uh, there is a mystique around Dr. J because of the ABA, because we did not get to see most of what he accomplished when he was at his physical peak. And then he came into a Sixers team that was pretty loaded with individual players, like George McGinnis in particular, I think was a guy who needed the ball a lot, put it that way.
Mhm.
And it was a tough time to be the third best franchise in the NBA when Birds, Celtics, and then Magic's Lakers came along, right? And then what I would move to when it comes to the Bird, there's a lot of debate, and it continues on. It will probably continue on, but long after you and I are gone, is who was the better player, Magic or Bird? Here's what I know. They faced off, including college, 4 times for a championship. Magic won 3 times. There can be no debate, no serious debate that they were both not surrounded by great players. So, I mean, it's a team sport and all of that, but basketball is one of these sports where the best player on the court can have the most impact. I would say, like in terms of Michael Jordan's teams that played against the Utah Jazz, I think 7 through 9, the Jazz probably were stronger, but 1 and 2 was a little more questionable with him and Pippen, right? And so to me, when I look at Magic Johnson, people there's a white man bias where folks like to say Larry Bird was the greatest player of all time because he was a white guy, to be perfectly honest. But when I look at the person who aligned with him most, Magic won 2 more titles. He won just as many MVPs. He won 3 MVP Finals awards, and he beat the a stacked Philadelphia 76ers team pretty much by himself when Kareem blew out his ankle his rookie year, and he played center in the deciding game, and eventually all 5 positions during that game. He had 42, 17, and 7, 42 points, 17 rebounds, and 7 assists. I think the argument, I mean, and Larry Bird is an extraordinary basketball player. If you watch his highlights, it'll make your eyes go roll in the back of your head. But so will Magic's. And when I look at it and I think about what someone accomplished and what players they had surrounding them, I think that Magic Johnson is the superior player of that era.
Yeah, they both had great talent around. I believe the Celtics had to make a trade to get Robert Parrish because he was
Mhm.
playing in Golden State at the time. And then they
Yep.
drafted McHale out
Yep.
of University of
McHale was the
Minnesota.
sixth man at one point. That's how good the Celtics were. McHale couldn't even start. I mean, think about it. The Larry Bird never won a title with Kurt Rambis as his power forward. You know what I mean? Couldn't do it.
Mm-mm. No, I
So,
couldn't do it. And I felt for me, being younger, born in 85, the closest I got to see the Magic and Larry playing was on 92 Dream Team. But of
Yeah,
course, I grew up during the era of Michael and
right.
how he pretty much took what Larry and Magic did and made the game global. And it was because of the 92 Dream Team that you
Yep.
saw all the influx of these now NBA players internationally who were kids watching the Dream Team and say, look, I want to be just like them, and that's where we have like the Lukas, the Jokic, the
Yep.
Giannis's, and
Yep.
everybody from abroad saying we're going to develop our game. And as we saw in this past Olympics, the rest of the world has caught up, and it's not going to be beat downs like Angola in '92.
Very international now. Yeah. The funny thing is that you could probably make a good argument that Magic and Larry, and if you want to go back further, Bill Russell, were the greatest team players. But I would say that Michael was the greatest player because his force of will, this sort of refuse to lose aspect, there's that whole idea that he was a ball hog and that he didn't pass enough and all that nonsense. All I know is whenever he got to the finals, he won. And look, there was that 2 year gap where he didn't play for a whole year, and then he was, getting back into the swing of things in the second year that when he came back. Michael is I've never seen a greater killer on the basketball court than Michael. And I know, this whole LeBron versus Michael thing. Look, I don't want to take anything away from LeBron. LeBron's one of the greatest players ever. You go to 10 finals, he played like how many extra seasons, and still kept getting back. But there's a difference between LeBron and Michael, and that is that Michael was a stone cold killer.
Yep, he was, and that arrival came in that '86 game at the Garden where he dropped 63, and Larry Bird gave that famous quote, that was God dressed as Michael Jordan. And he did it in the first Air Jordans, and everybody knew that it was on. It was
You
Michael's
know,
league.
you know what was funny about watching Larry give that quote? You would have sworn they lost the game. And the Celtics actually won the game. But you would
Right.
have sworn because Larry was recognizing, I think, if I'm guessing here, that there was somebody better than him. And I don't think Larry believed that there was anybody better than him until he saw Michael Jordan do that.
Yeah, and like how you mentioned, Michael was a stone cold killer. And when you think of the younger generation, RIP Kobe, Kobe was their Jordan because Kobe pretty much patterned his whole game after Jordan.
Yep. But what I will argue though is that through what Kobe had 5 titles. I would say on 3 of those 5 titles, he was the best player on the team. On 2 of those, what Shaquille O'Neal did to Dikembe Mutombo against the Sixers should actually be illegal. I mean, he butchered him, and Dikembe did everything right. But you could actually see Shaq putting his shoulder in Dikembe's chest and Dikembe's feet leaving the ground. And Dikembe was one of the greatest defensive centers in the history of the NBA, and it just didn't matter. That's how big of a force Shaq was. He just wasn't interested in staying fit. And
Hmm.
and like Barkley, I think is another comparison to be made there.
Yeah, RIP to Kimmy Mutombo because Shaq learned from
Yeah.
when he got that barbecue chicken the first time from Hakeem the Dream in the NBA Finals, where and looking back in hindsight, he never should have left Orlando. They should have
Yeah.
kept him and Penny Moore, added a
Yep.
third guy,
Yep.
and Orlando would have had a championship or two if they would have kept Shaq and Penny together. Because you don't let that unicorn get out of Orlando with 4 years. And Jerry West, rest in peace, logo, made the call, say, hey, Shaq, come on to La La Land because Shaq had heard the article from the Orlando
Yep.
Sentinel about how he wasn't worth this money. He was going to resign. This was all in the 30 for 30, this magic moment, because
Yep.
he saw what Alonzo Mourning got on the market. He like,
Yeah.
oh, if Alonzo's getting this, I know I'm worth this.
He
And
was
Jerry
far better
West
than
swooped in
so.
and made the
Yeah.
call.
Yeah.
No, but Alonzo Mourning was no slouch either. And just to
No, he
think
was a great
about
player.
it, and
Yeah,
just to think about him, Dikembe Mutombo, and we got to throw Patrick Ewing in there. All of them went to Georgetown. Rest in peace, John
yep,
Thompson,
yeah,
AI,
yeah.
Georgetown, and how those teams, even though Georgetown is not an HBCU, you're in
No.
DC, what was Chocolate City, and
Well,
demographics very
Georgetown
different
is
now. And
very
just how like DC and Georgetown during that period it was it was a basketball mecca when you had them. You had University of Maryland and
yep.
UVA with Ralph Sampson, and it was
Georgetown,
amazing.
Georgetown, when you look at their student body, is actually a very white school. It was the athletes that were different. And John Thompson was big on making sure that athletes of color got a chance at Georgetown to improve their lives. I mean, John Thompson is a legend and he deserves a statue probably in all 50 states. I'm glad you mentioned Hakeem because I don't think I've ever seen a more skilled center. You can say that somebody else was better or worse, but in terms of pure skill, rebounding, passing, scoring, playing the passing lanes, blocking shots defensively. I think the one great thing that came out of Jordan's 2 year sabbatical or 1 3/4 year sabbatical, if you want to call it that, was that we got a chance to appreciate what an extraordinary basketball player Hakeem Olajuwon was. His decimation of David Robinson in the conference finals the one year was. I remember David Robinson saying after the finals were over, and he won the MVP that year. I think he might even been Defensive Player of the Year that year, and he said something to along the effects of, "Guys, I know it's hard to believe, but I really did my best against him." That's how good Hakeem was.
And the Admiral wasn't no slouch himself either.
What's that?
I said the Admiral wasn't no slouch himself
No,
either.
no, he's a great player. He was a phenomenal player, a top 50 all time. Yeah, absolutely.
And the Spurs got their next great one in Victor Wembanyama.
Yeah, yeah. That guy doesn't make sense. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they don't make them like that. I mean, I don't know if it's the baguette bread or if it's the macaroons or is it the madeleines that they feeding over there or the steak and pommes frites. But whatever it is that he's eating, feed him because Wembanyama is going to be a big problem once he really fills out and
yep.
really gets on that Giannis workout plan
I
because
was
he's
gonna say
because
Greek
he's
freak.
on that
Yeah, yeah,
Giannis weight
right.
when Giannis first came in the league, and then
Yep.
once Giannis started bulking up and started eating the mashed potatoes and PB and J's, that was
Yeah.
after the locker room. He got a championship and league MVP. So, what is your take on today's NBA with it being more global now, and we actually haven't had a U.S. MVP winner since Harden in I believe 17-18. The
Yeah.
last six MVP winners have been all international.
Yeah, personally, I don't care who wins the MVP, and this is I can actually segue this into the Oscars because there's been this over recent years, the Academy at the Oscars has become more international and more diverse. I don't care who wins as long as they do good work.
Mhm.
And so it doesn't bother me at all. I mean, I remember there was a time, I'm a big tennis fan. I remember there was a time when I used to root for McEnroe, Connors, Agassi, I didn't root for Sampras because he was boring, but that where I rooted for, the American tennis players, and same with the women on that side. I remember the point when I saw Roger Federer play. And then I, read some interviews with him. And as I become older, I still have my Reds attachment and my Kentucky Wildcats attachment. But when it comes to favorite teams, I don't really have that anymore. I become attached to personalities and who they are and what they have to say and their own personal courage and stepping out beyond their sport and
Mhm.
and having something to say. Steph Curry is a great example of that. He is, I mean, not he's soft spoken, but his words carry weight. And he's also a great basketball player and deliriously fun to watch. So for me, I've never I've I reached a point, I don't know where the point was, but I reached a point where I'd rather follow athletes I admire than I would, there's that whole thing where, and I think this happens in politics, as has happened in politics too, where it becomes like a team sport. Uh, that guy may be a jerk, but he's my jerk. I
Mhm.
dismiss that. If that person's a jerk, they're still a jerk. And I would rather follow the storyline of somebody of value on a higher level
Mhm.
beyond their sport itself.
Yeah. And we're recording this podcast on Saturday, March the 8th, and it was reported yesterday on Friday, March the 7th, that Dwayne Wiggins from Tony passed away,
Uh,
and tying that to Sly
uh,
Stone
yeah,
with the documentary Sly Lives, aka The Burden of Black Genius, and how Sly Stone pretty much started that blueprint for
yeah.
all of those Bay Area funk acts, and of course Tony comes a part of that lineage. So let's talk about Sly, Tony, and all of those influences coming out of the Bay Area.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think they call James Brown the Godfather of soul, but I think he was also the Godfather of funk. But what Sly did was expanded beyond that. There was funk, psychedelia, rock and roll, R&B, soul, even a little bit of blues tinged in Sly's music. And I think that his desire to have an interracial band in the 60s, we have to remember that in the 50s and the 60s, being a black artist and breaking through on pop radio was not very easy to do. Pat Boone had a bigger hit with Tutti Frutti, which is hilarious considering what Tutti Frutti is actually about, than Little Richard did, right? And so when you look at what Sly did, his first couple albums did kind of middling business. And then he came out with Dance to the Music, and all of a sudden he was at number one. And, white radio, top 40 radio accepted him. And I think you can see his persuasion, his lineage carry through. I mean, there would be no Prince in the Revolution. I don't believe without Sly and the Family Stone. There would be some version of Prince. He was too talented not to become something. But I do think that Prince took some cues in terms of wanting his band to uh I mean, like Sly put white people and black people on his album cover. It was unheard of at the time. And so that's an extraordinary thing. And Sly was also a little bit like Prince, maybe not quite as instrumentally widespread as Prince was, but he was capable of playing almost any instrument as well, if not better, than the people in his band. But he wanted a band. That was important. He wanted a street gang, if you so to speak, to go out there with. And I think one of the things that you discover in the Sly Lives documentary, which I have a couple of minor issues with, but overall I think is really, really terrific, is that Sly had terrible stage fright. And he suffered from anxiety, which was not something in the late 60s, early 70s that you were allowed to deal with. And so when he would come out on stage 2 to 3 hours late sometimes as the headliner. But at Woodstock, the biggest venue he probably ever played, the way he got on stage was sniffing line of cokes to give him courage. A line of coke, lines of coke, I should say, to give him courage. And he performed a phenomenal set. The problem, of course, is that the more drugs you do, the more drugs you need. And there is a point of diminishing returns where the drugs where the drugs negate the creativity. And I think you saw that in Sly's case, and I think you saw that in the documentary too.
And he also used one of the early versions of the drum machine, the Rhythm King, which I didn't realize until
I didn't
watching the
either.
documentary until that. And they said Family Affair, that was pretty much on that primitive version of the drum machine, and then how the album cover, the original album cover for There's a Riot Going On, was the inspiration for the album cover for Stankonia for Outkast. And Andre
Yeah,
3000,
I didn't know
mentioned
that
that.
either. And the thing about that drum machine is it's basically a toy at that point. It's not like I mean, I granted it's an instrument, but it's like the thing you give to your kid, so they can start taking an interest in music. But he just kind of figured out a way to reprogram it to make this incredible, underbelly for a family affair. It's interesting because Prince had five number one hits. Two of them had no bass on them. One was Kiss, and the other was When Doves Cry. And there's a point on When Doves Cry where the only thing you hear is Prince's voice and a drum machine. Now, I'm not saying Prince said, I'm doing the thing that Sly did. I'm not
Mhm.
saying that. I'm saying that if Sly hadn't done that, the possibility might not have been available to Prince in the same way that it was.
Yeah, he pretty much kind of laid the blueprint that Prince studied, and Prince added his own elements to it to make it his.
Exactly. I got the opportunity I never got to see Sly because he was long past, I mean, he was basically in his JD Salinger disappearance days, when I was of age. But I did get to see Prince twice, and the second time was at the Fox Theater in Detroit. And it was really one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life in terms of viewing a live performance. He played for about 2 hours, and then the house lights came on, and then the music played by somebody else, the music that tells you to go, right?
Mhm.
Uh, but a certain number of us didn't want to go. 2 hours was great, but we wanted more. So we stuck around and we kept cheering. And so the roadies were coming out and they were starting to disconnect things. I remember one of the roadies looking over at us and making this motion, upward motion like this with his hands, which essentially saying, keep cheering, keep shouting, right? And so we did. We followed his guidance. And then a few minutes later, we start to see the roadies plug the instruments back in, right? And so then Prince comes back out. He does another hour, and he goes from I mean, and this is when he was with the NPG. This is a Diamonds and Pearls tour. He goes to each artist, that was, I mean, and all the NPG was top notch, right? I know the Revolution was when he hit his peak in terms of commercial, but the NPG was a more flexible band in terms of playing jazz, rhythm and blues, and rock and roll and all the things, right? He would go and take the bass out of his bass player's hand and play a better bass than that guy. He would go to his keyboard player and play a better keyboard than that guy. And granted, there's no point even talking about the guitar. And he would do the same thing with his drum player. It was extraordinary. I started out in the 32nd row, which is not a bad seat. I ended up about 8 people lengths from Prince. And I remember I looked behind me because at the Fox Theater they have a balcony there. And the balcony was going up and down from the people who remained who were jumping. And I remember thinking, well, that looks dangerous. But I also remember thinking, if this is how I go out, shit could be worse.
Yeah, yeah, because if you saw Prince live, it was like Haley's Comet because you never know when it was gonna come back around again. And just recently, I had Dr. Fink on Beyond the album cover,
Yeah.
and we got into talking about all things Prince and how when they opened up for Rick James on the, I believe it
Mhm.
was Live It Up tour, and how Rick James felt the heat so much so it
Yeah.
was like, I'm gonna unplug your stuff because he knew like, oh, this brother's bad. He's coming.
Yeah, it's funny. After Prince opened for the Rolling Stones and he got booed off the stage, I can't remember where the venue was. Prince swore he'd never open for anybody else again, and he never needed to at that point. After that point, and I remember Mick Jagger trying to make good with the audience that they should have showed Prince more respect because the Stones chose him, as their opening act. It's a funny thing. like Otis Redding didn't like to have Sam and Dave open for him because the energy level was so incomparable.
You
Yeah,
couldn't
that
top it.
I got to do that too, So I mean, I think it's a tough gig, and I understand Rick's challenge, but sometimes when you pick the underdog becomes the overdog.
Yeah, it's almost like when the Rolling Stones had to go after James Brown on the Tammy show.
Who wants to do that?
I mean, James Brown should have just closed, and the Stones should have been like, nope, nope, we ain't following that. Cancel our performance because
No
James
need.
Brown just literally tore the stage down.
Yeah, and the Stones are one of the greatest rock bands in history, but when JB was at his peak and he was giving his all, during that era, he was untoppable.
Yeah, it was like he just shot of a cannon and pretty much just gave you full song, full dance, full showmanship for hours. And of course, the bit with the cape that came from the wrestler Gorgeous George
Yes.
and how he saw Gorgeous George wrestling, whether it be on TV or the live show or whatever. Said, I'm gonna put some pizzazz on it because he knew I gotta sell something. It's got to be a show and to give the illusion of I'm tired, I want to
Yeah.
go put the cape on, but then tease them, leave the audience
Yeah.
lingering, leave them wanting, and then throw the cape off and go back and give them more. So he understood the power
Brilliant.
of how to control an audience, and that when you're on that stage, you are in control. And another artist that was a master at controlling the audience, Michael Joseph Jackson.
Absolutely. And it's a funny thing. I've always said this. If you're a huge music fan, you can like both the Stones and the Beatles, and you can like both Prince and Michael Jackson, but you do have to choose if you're a huge music fan. If you're a casual, it's different, right? I was a Stones over Beatles guy. And I will defend this to the end of my time. I like the dirtier, gnarlier sort of thing that the Stones were doing. I know it may not have been as psychedelic or free flowing, but the Stones could also play live. The Beatles gave up playing live. Not that the Beatles couldn't play live, but they gave up playing live long before they ended. So I've always been kind of a Stones guy. In fact, one of the highlights of the Oscars was watching an 81-year-old Mick Jagger strut out on stage and thinking, God, I wish I had that energy at my age. But anyway, and then when it comes to Prince and Michael Jackson, the differentiation for me, other than attachment to the music, I grew up in a challenging environment as a youth. And when Doves Cry spoke to my youth, between my mother and my father and all of that. So that was, and also I have to say, when I saw Purple Rain, I was too young. I had to either sneak in the theater by buying a ticket for something else, or I would lie to the small town ticket holder and say my parents knew that I was going to an R-rated movie. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes you bought the ticket to the other movie that was playing. But I saw it several times during its run in theaters originally, and I remember thinking, look, the movie ages. Um, you could argue that there's some rudimentary aspects to it. There's not a tremendous storyline. There's some misogyny in there that doesn't age well to this day. Some of the acting is uneven, but I remember thinking that was the dividing line for me between enjoying something you heard and art. It changed my perception not only about music, but about film, but about art in general. To see someone of that caliber. And here's where Prince differentiates to Michael Jackson. My father-in-law once said that Michael Jackson needed Quincy Jones. Prince was Quincy Jones and Michael Jackson all put together. He could produce himself. He could play Michael couldn't play an instrument. If you remember and I remember listening to this from talking about the greatest night in pop with Dr. Fink, Lionel Richie talks about the fact that Michael Jackson couldn't play an instrument. So he had to hum, very tunefully, of course. He had to hum the sound that he was looking for, and Lionel would either have to play it on piano or another instrument to try to get to it. Prince was not making music for the masses. Michael was always chasing Thriller after he made it. You can look at the albums that came after. There was the guest guitarist song, there was the Save the Children song, there was the syrupy ballad song, there was the kind of half-assed novelty song that would always be on those records. Prince was making music for himself, and you could take or leave it. And I greatly, greatly admired that sort of artistic integrity. This, regardless of how you felt about the album.
Yeah, Prince was an artist. He didn't care whether the songs were going to go commercial, while Michael was all commercial. It was all about the fans, all about the people. And you mentioned Quincy Jones, and we just lost Quincy Jones, and the
Yeah.
Oscars did a tribute to Quincy Jones. So can you just talk
Not
about
a
his
good enough
impact?
one, by the way. Not a good enough one, by the way. I would have rather they would have had the orchestra play. I mean, not the Queen Latifah did a fine job of doing Ease on Down the Road, but I would have rather they done a compilation of his scores. I mean, they didn't even mention In the Heat of the Night, which he scored. That was a miss by me to my mind. But yeah, Quincy Jones was fabulous, even though he never really reconciled with Prince not showing up for We Are the World.
Yeah, because they wanted Prince to do We Are the World, and as we saw in The Greatest Night in Pop, Sheila
Yeah.
E. was sadly the bait
Eight.
to try to lure Prince to the studio, but I'm sure Prince knew that, Michael was going to be there, and that as we see with Prince, Prince had to be in control of
Yes.
everything. And if it
Yes.
wasn't for him, by him, he wasn't
He
going to
didn't
play
want
a
nothing to do
part.
with it.
He was more, unless I'm controlling the ship, I'm not playing with anybody in the sandbox.
Yep, and Prince offered them a guitar solo, and I totally understand Quincy's perspective. He was trying to produce a track in a night that was usable, and he did. I mean, We Are the World is not a great song by any measure, but it is a song. It did the service it was intended to. And Quincy left no room for a guitar solo. He wasn't planning on that. They were trying to get everybody out by like 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. So, for Prince to say, well, I'll give you a guitar solo, I can understand Quincy going, I haven't left room for that. We've got to get this done. My favorite factoid, Prince related anyway, about that documentary is that Huey Lewis ended up singing the verse that they were saving for Prince, which, my goodness, what a difference. I mean, Huey Lewis was a fine bar band type singer. I don't want to, trash him too much, but boy, to think that, what might have been in
Mhm.
that case. But I get it, Prince was never going to be part of somebody else's project.
Right. So, what's your take on the Netflix documentary that was being worked on by Ezra Elderman from the Oscar award-winning documentary OJ Made in America getting scrapped, and how Netflix had said there'll probably be another documentary, but it's going to
Yeah.
be curated by the estate. And when I heard that, to me, that screamed fluff piece,
Yes.
carefully manicured, curated to protect the brand, because as we know, you're worth more dead than alive.
And look, you could do a 6 hour Prince docu-series that was nothing but live performances from different arenas, and it would be hella entertaining. I mean, I don't think that that's in question. I think, I really feel for Ezra. I believe in the truth. I don't believe in sacred cows. I've been to Paisley Park. I've done the full tour, the expensive tour. It was phenomenal. Look, I'm as big a Prince. My father-in-law bought me purple shorts because I'm such a big Prince fan, and I look funny in them, but I do wear them. And you know, I'm a big believer that if you're going to tell the story, tell all of it. And
Agreed.
there's no way to technically tell all of it because a person lived 57 years. You can't do a 57-hour, 57-year documentary, right? But, the technicality that got Paisley Park out of the estate, out of allowing the documentary to go forward is that it was originally supposed to be 6 hours. Ezra turned in a 9-hour cut. Anybody, and what always confuses me about this is that if you saw the O.J. Simpson documentary that he did, it's stunning to me that Netflix chose Ezra and the Prince estate didn't look at Ezra and say, this guy's going to give no quarter. He's going to give us the real deal, right? And so the fact that Ezra spent nearly half a decade of his life on this and, you know, included accusations that by Jill Jones, probably I assume, by Sinead O'Connor. You can look at Questlove's quote that it broke his heart and kind of, but yet he still loves the man. And Prince did a lot of wonderful things in his life, I mean, he was a very complex individual. He paid for funerals we don't know about. He helped pay for Black Girls Code. And he never asked for any uh, grandeur for that. I don't think he would even be in favor of a statue because he was Jehovah's Witness when he died. But the idea that the doc, whatever comes next, this shelved 9-hour documentary, and you have to think that Ezra probably thought, you asked me for 6 hours, I'm bringing you 9 hours of extraordinary stuff. And he probably thought he was giving them a bonus. And then to try to cut 3 hours down, which would include cutting down all of the stuff that the estate didn't want to hear,
Right.
didn't want to have talked about. Um, it would have been what's known as hagiography, which is just portraying Prince as a saint. And we know, from his treatment of some of his band members and, some of the women he was with, that he wasn't that. He was a complex individual. That doesn't mean he had a bad heart. That doesn't mean he was an evil person or any of that. But we deserve, if you're going to do it, don't bullshit it.
Yep,
Give
tell the
truth.
whole truth and nothing but, which I was surprised that Dr. Fink answered that question as
Me
open and as
too.
honestly as he
Yep.
did, because feeling that he would be very protective of the brand and being so close to Prince
Yep.
that you don't want to speak no ill will, but he gave the full honest truth.
Well, you look at the Michael Jackson documentary I mean, it wasn't really a Michael Jackson documentary, but it was about the two men who claimed to have been abused by Michael
Oh,
Jackson.
Finding Neverland.
Exactly, thank you. They seem very credible to me in terms of their concerns. And when you look at the pattern of Michael kind of changing out young boys over and over again. It seemed credible. Now, do we really know? No, and I'm not going to paint Michael Jackson as a pedophile. It was never proven, and all of that. But there's a lot of smoke there, right? And here's the thing: people still love Michael Jackson. People still play Michael Jackson's records. I don't think it's hurt him his legacy wise. I don't think it's hurt him nearly as much as one might think. So if Prince was abusive on occasion to women or bandmates, I think we are capable of human beings is saying two things can be true at the same time. He sometimes he was not a good person, and other times he was a very good person. And I think all of this comes back to the cost of genius. When we talk about geniuses, if you think about it, how many people do they have to relate to? How many people can actually talk to a Prince or a Michael Jackson or a James Brown or a Stevie Wonder and be on their level? I think the number is very few, and it has to create a sort of lonely life for you. And maybe that creates the agitation that makes you act out in unpleasant ways. I mean, I'm playing junior psychologist now, but I think we deserve to know if you're going to do a documentary on Prince, as much as a documentary can reveal who that person was. What's the point otherwise?
Yeah, and you mentioned with geniuses, you're often at that lonely table for one, and like Brian Wilson said, and the classic Beach Boys record on Pet Sounds, I guess that just wasn't made for these times, and just how when you're so far ahead the curve and
Yeah.
that you're 1 to 2 steps ahead of everybody, it's hard for you to be common when you are an uncommon person.
Well, look how much better around the world in a day sounds today than it did at the time. Look how much better Parade sounds today than it did at the time. I think all of those, both of those albums are pretty avant-garde. I think 1999 and Purple Rain was not a case of Prince catering to the audience. I think it was a case of the audience catching up to Prince. And
Mhm.
by the time when they caught up to him, he moved on and they
Yeah.
weren't ready to move on. They wanted Purple Rain too.
Yeah,
And
because as we know, labels are risk averse, and once you get that commercial hit, they want to rinse, wash, repeat. We want the
yep,
same thing. That's why there was never a European leg or the Purple Rain tour,
yep,
and he was working on Around the World in a Day as the Purple Rain tour was simultaneously going on. Because when you're that creative, you don't want to cater to the demands of a label of the least common denominator audience
yep.
and give them the same thing that made you a success. You're thankful for it,
Yep.
but you don't want to get stuck playing the same thing over and over because there's no fun for you in that.
No, and there was no American leg of the Sign of the Times tour. That was a European tour. Largely. I mean, granted, some of the Sign of the Times concert film was recorded at Paisley Park on stage, and there was a mixture. I think the other part was recorded in France. You can quote me on that, but I think I'm pretty sure I'm right. The idea that Prince wanted to put out an album every year, the label was against that. They wanted to work the album for its singles and go 2 years, with each album, and that was not what he was into. And there was a reason, look, the history of record labels and deals, if the initial deal you get is one of the worst deals anyone could get in any business function ever. They basically own you. They put out this money. You got to pay it back. Their investment in you is not really an investment. It is a loan essentially. And so the only point when you really have power is when you get to the end of your record deal and you're still a top seller. That's when they will throw a lot of money at you to stay around. The hit that Prince took with the slave years and the artist formerly known as years, there was a lot of bordering on humiliation from the general public towards him. George Michael, Pearl Jam, to a lesser degree, Tom Petty when he refused to raise like Tom Petty, at one point he was going to put out a new album. They were going to raise the price on it, and he said, "If you raise the price on it, I'm going to name the album $7.99." Those people all took a hit, and I don't think any two people took more of a hit to give the artist more of a chance than Prince and George Michael. I
Mhm.
think it hurt their careers in terms of pop radio and just the whole fight that they went through with their labels more than it did probably anybody else I can think of.
Yeah, and I'm thinking you're speaking of the Listen Without Prejudice era,
Yep.
George Michael after Faith crossed over pop. was number one on R&B, won Best Soul Album, Best Male R&B Artist at the AMAs that year, and he caught backlash. And of course, we know the real reasons why. It has to do with 400 years of it in the R word. Look it up in the history before they
And
erase
George was
it.
embarrassed. George was embarrassed to win that R&B award. I mean, he stated it, himself. The interesting thing about Listen Without Prejudice is it's probably the best John Lennon album that John Lennon never made. It's phenomenal. It's probably better than Faith. It's just not as easy as Faith.
Right.
George was a great artist.
Yeah, Faith was definitely the home run commercial out the box hit. And then looking at that Wham documentary on Netflix that came
Yeah,
out a year or two ago, how Andrew Ridgeley had the foresight to know I'm not going to hold my friend back.
right.
He's destined to be bigger than Wham. And who am I to say, no, you can't do that. You're going to break up something good that we had here. And he allowed George to spread his wings musically, artistically, and creatively, and not let the friendship get in the way of that.
And let's say this too about George. He was a very sweet man. And he had his problems, but George made sure that Andrew had a co-writing credit on Careless Whisper, which will keep Andrew in the money for the rest of his life. The interesting thing is if you watch that Wham documentary and then the George Michael documentary, they're so tonally different. Wham is about the upswing, and then the George Michael documentary is about here's the even bigger explosion. But then here's the question that George asks himself: is this the artist I want to be? And do I want to be tied to the label strings? There's some real similarities. And Prince actually, I can't remember what award show it was, but he paid kudos to George at that award show for standing up, to the record label.
Yeah, because when you listen to Wham's Make It Big album, definitely hear the influence in the love letter from Motown, because all of those
Yes.
Brits were influenced by the
Yep.
Northern Soul
Yep.
sound movement, which was pretty much their take on Motown. And for George Michael to have the cojones to tell Jerry Wexler down at Muscle Shoals at Fame
Yes.
Studios that, nope, this ain't it. I'm going to go cut my own version of Careless Whisper.
Yep.
I mean, huge stones.
Yeah, I mean George became his own producer after that, and if you listen to his version of "They Won't Go When I Go" on "Listen Without Prejudice," it's a stunner. And I don't know what Stevie's opinion of it is because obviously Stevie wrote the original, and his version is extraordinary too. But I remember it's not that long ago actually. I was watching, I was just flipping through YouTube, and there is at the Freddie Mercury tribute concert. It shows George, practicing through Somebody to Love.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and there's David Bowie and Seal coming out to watch George Michael practice. You know what I mean? Not a game, but
We're talking
practice.
about practice, and it
We're
was
talking
rehearsal, and he was going like full throttle.
full throttle. Yeah, he wasn't half-assing it. I mean, you could say that the performance he gave on the night of maybe was 10% more than what he gave when he was doing, when he was kind of working it out with the members of Queen. But he was not he was ready to go that night, that
Hmm.
day, and when you get Bowie and Seal, and look, yeah, I know Seal's taken some shots over the years, but Seal's early stuff is pretty forward thinking. And David Bowie, I think, is the second greatest solo artist ever after Prince. And the two of them, looking out there, nodding their heads and saying, I mean, they were out there because they wanted to see what the youngin could do. And he did it.
Right, and we're gonna stay across the pond on the Brits. Know you had a chance to see the movie A Better Man, which was about
Oh,
Robbie Williams. And
yeah.
did your view of Robbie Williams change after watching that, and kind of felt like with him being, I believe he was the youngest member of Take That,
He
and
was.
just
Yeah.
being thrust into that whole spotlight at such a young age. And by the time when Back for Good became a hit here in the States,
Yeah.
they were coming off the tail end of their run in Europe and the native UK. And then he became a massive solo superstar in
Yep.
Europe, had moderate success here in the US.
Yep.
But if you go to Europe, Robbie Williams is a star.
It's a funny thing. Robbie Williams was the biggest star in the world everywhere except for the United States when he was at his peak. And I was a fan. And I was a fan because these songs were relentlessly catchy. It was earworm after earworm. You listen to the 12 to 13 songs he would have on his album, and you would say, shit, all these sound like singles. And the fact that he never crossed over, I haven't been able to the States, I should say. I've never been able quite to figure it out. I watched Better Man. I reviewed it for our website. I also talked to the VFX team, and I remember, I remember when it started out with Robbie Williams being played as a virtual chimpanzee, and I thought, are they really doing this? What's happening? I remember thinking, blinking my eyes and wondering if there was something in my drink, right? And no, it didn't change my opinion of Robbie because Robbie's always been so honest about his downfalls that to see them played out. And the whole idea of having him played by a VFX chimpanzee came from an interview that he did in England. I forget with who, but it might have been Graham Norton. But he said, "I'm just a performing monkey." And so the director of the film, who also made The Greatest Show on Earth with Hugh Jackman, a movie I didn't like, to be perfectly honest, he took the idea from that and he said, let's just make Robbie a chimpanzee throughout the movie. And what it allowed him to do, especially when Robbie plays the adult era Robbie, is use Robbie's voice. And Robbie's voice, his personality, his snarkiness, his mixture of sarcasm and pain really came through. I honestly I had it like number 5 or 6 on my best films of the year. I was so disappointed that it didn't do better at the theaters, but it was one of the biggest swings of the year, and I found it to be a very, very brave film, and I was really hoping that it would, and maybe it still will. I think it will become a cult classic. I think that's already in dyed in the wool. But yeah, I was a big fan of Robbie back then. I was a big fan of his vulnerability and all the stuff that the drug use, the family stuff, I knew at least a little bit about. But to see it play out in the film the way that it did, I remember actually my wife was out of town and I took a screenshot while I was watching it because I got a screener of it for review. I took a screenshot of it and it was him doing My Way, right? And I sent it to my wife and I said, tell me I'm not hallucinating, that this really is a monkey singing My Way as Robbie Williams. And she goes, you're not hallucinating, you know? It's one of the bravest movies I've seen and boldest moves that I've seen in many years. And I don't even like musicals that much, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, and to think of the analogy of being a performance monkey, when you come from that line of work, being in a boy group, everything
Yep.
is pretty much scheduled, dictated to you. You necessarily don't have room to breathe. And like I mentioned earlier, with him being the youngest member, he necessarily didn't really have the coping skills to cope with
Yep.
instant fame.
And he was caged. His contributions were very limited. Gary Barlow was considered the genius of the group, and it's funny that one of my favorite parts of Better Man is when and it's the VFX is extraordinary, but when they do the song, oh gosh, why am I blanking on it? Gosh, the song that the band does that takes them from into the street out into buildings and back out into the street. That sequence, that that is take that doing a Robbie Williams solo song. And I always wondered, was that like a little bit of a shiv, Because Robbie eclipsed Take Back and then some, and I
Yeah.
know they've made up since then and they're friendly now. I think that's one of the things that I think that probably would have come out in the Prince documentary that we'll never see, is that when Prince got older, he got softer. Him and Morris made up. Him and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis made up. Sheila was cool with him. The only person I think who wasn't particularly cool with him was Jesse Johnson.
Right. And you mentioned how as time passes, wounds tend to heal, any bad blood tends to go away. And we seeing that now because Five just recently announced that they're getting back together doing tours around the UK. And I know Abs and Jay had their reasons for falling out of the band. And now all five members are back. And then what we see now with New Edition, all six on board. And when they had the miniseries came out in 2017, what made that miniseries so special and up there with The Temptations, The Jacksons, and American Dream is top, biopics for the culture, and is how they were able to tell their story with all six members still being living and present. And just, I feel like New Edition, they're getting their flowers more now after the miniseries. And when you take a look at what they did in the industry as a group, as solo artists, and how they started off as kids. Johnny had a solo career prior
Yep,
to coming into New Edition. And then to see how they were all able to have solo success, how if it wasn't for Michael Bivins, no Another Bad Creation,
right.
no Boys to Men. He influenced, what
Oh,
was
and
to become
of
one of
course,
the moguls.
his own band, Belba DeVoe.
BBD and
Yeah,
how their look and style BBD influenced TLC. Because if you look at the styling of
yeah,
TLC on
totally.
the album cover on the TLC tip, definitely influenced by BBD. So just talk about the influence and the legacy of New Edition as individuals and collectively as a group.
I think there is no contest that New Edition is head, shoulders, and miles above any boy band of that era or came after, like New Kids on the Block, Backstreet Boys, and Sync, all of that. I think if they had been white kids, they would have been even more popular. Their songs were better, their vocals were better, their talent level was off the charts. I mean, Bobby Brown was probably the worst singer in the band. I mean, as far as like hitting notes and all of that kind of thing, but he had personality, which makes up for a lot. Girlfriend's a wonderful song. I think I think New Edition remains greatly underappreciated because they were just about 6 to 7 years ahead of the boy band explosion, and they were out there kind of on an island on their own. And I don't think there's any question that the talent level among the fullness of the band is higher than anybody who came after them. Sure, Justin Timberlake is very, very talented. But you look at the rest of them. I mean, there was nobody on New Kids in the Block who, you looked at afterwards and said, I mean, a couple of the guys had, I think McIntyre and the other leads.
Jordan.
Jordan, yeah, Jordan Knight. They had a hit, but none of them were able to sustain, real careers. They end up on reality shows and stuff like that. New Edition was just really, really wonderful.
Right, and then the secret sauce for New Edition was Brooke Payne, choreographer Ronnie DeVoe's uncle, who pretty much
Mm.
took them as kids because they were formed in '78, and then it wasn't until '81 at the Hollywood Talent Night at the Strand Theater in Boston that Maurice Starr, even though
Yeah,
New Edition didn't win the contest, saw like, hey,
he
these boys got
recognized.
something. He
Yeah.
recognized something. I'm gonna record them anyway and put out Candy Girl. Then we got to give Maurice credit too, because if it wasn't for him working with New Edition, and once New Edition and him had that falling out after they left Streetwise to go to MCA, that he said, I'm going to create another group that's going to be pretty much New Edition times two, but do it with white boys.
Yeah, right, right.
That's where we get new kids, and I had a chance to interview Maurice Starr and Danny Wood on separate occasions. And how, as we see in previous interviews and all interviews new kids do, they always defer back to New Edition because
Mm.
everybody always wants to put the boy band tag on new kids, but new kids always say no, New
Well,
Edition first.
and all those boy bands tended to have a falling out with management because and it makes sense because management sees them as kids, and then as they develop as artists, and Barry Gordy had these own challenges, particularly with Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye, I would say, although Marvin was a little older than Stevie, in letting them find their own artistic space, and so it's not surprising that boy bands, and I kind of hate that term, but vocal groups, I prefer that. New Edition to me is closer to the Temptations, they're just younger, right?
Mhm.
And I think that what we run into is, you can go back as far as Elvis Presley and Colonel Parker, right? The person who discovers you always thinks they know best. But as you develop as an artist, as you become maybe you become a songwriter, maybe you become a person who understands melody better. You want to start inserting your own ideas, and and management typically wants you, like you were talking about record labels, typically wants you to churn out the same thing that you've been churning out.
Yeah, because I believe Gary Barlow was the chief songwriter for Take That, wrote
Yep.
majority of their hits. And I know when they broke up, he went solo, and of course Robbie went solo. Robbie had the biggest success, but Gary, I think here in the States, if he would have kind of got on the adult contemporary lane, I
Yeah.
think he would have found his niche here in the
Yep.
States because Back for Good, great record. Like I
Yeah.
said, got them there hit here in the States, but they were off of their massive whirlwind success in Europe, and they were inspired by New Kids. Well, Nigel Martin Smith was inspired by New Kids and decided, hey, let me go ahead and put this together. And then that later led to Boyzone, Westlife, Five, and then all of those great UK boy and girl acts of the 90s, early 2000s. And that's how I knew who Simon Cowell was before he came
Yeah,
on
that's right.
American Idol,
Yeah.
because Simon was responsible for Five, and I believe he, along with Louis Walsh, who created Boyzone, had something to do with Westlife as well.
Yeah, I mean, Gary was a really good ballad writer. I mean, I think if we were to think of it in 70s term, he would have really fit in with the soft rock era,
The
very
yacht rock period.
yeah, the yacht rock. Yeah, it totally. Well, it's just barely rock, but whatever. But Robbie was snottier. I don't know if and I mean that as a compliment. Robbie had an edge to him, which I thought made him more interesting. But playing it safe certainly has its value when it comes to selling records. And I think you're right. If Gary had gone solo and been managed in the right way, he might have been able to have a U.S. career. And he did, look, he did fine overseas. Nobody should cry for Gary Barlow.
Mhm.
I mean, he's living in a nicer house than you and I are, I'm sure.
Mhm.
Uh, but he did not, he was eclipsed by far by his own bandmate, who was the tyke in the band.
Right, and I was surprised when I was looking at Celine Dion's documentary how they never really tried to cross Celine to R&B because vocally
Yeah.
she could do it.
She did
Voice
the voice
same vein
of
of
R. Kelly.
Whitney,
She did the
Mariah. Oh
voice,
yeah, I'm Your Angel,
but that's
but it
it.
was clear where they were like, okay, pop is gonna be your bread and butter.
Yep. Yeah, they caged her a bit, and it worked for a long time. So it's hard to argue against it from a financial perspective. I have this perspective on singers like Whitney, Celine, and Mariah. This is to take nothing away from their talent, but I think there's a difference between the best singing and the most singing. And I kind of blame all three of those for the American Idol sort of generation, where the glory note was what you were always aiming for. There was always had to be this, like the best stuff for Whitney Houston to me was the early stuff. Saving All My Love for You would have been a hit for Roberta Flack. You know what I mean? I mean, it was
Rest
just
in
a,
peace.
yes, rest in peace, by the way. A lovely song that just hit the mark. Mariah Carey's Vision of Love could have worked for Aretha Franklin, as far as that goes. But I think they're what people often respond to is not subtlety. They respond to the big thing. And I think for all three of those artists, they got pushed in the direction of, I mean, like there's notes that Mariah Carey can hit that, dogs from 6 miles away can hear that you and I can't, right?
Right.
Um, but did she need that? I don't think she did. I think it's better to save that. Prince knew how to do that. When you listen to like a song like The Beautiful Ones, Prince works his way there, and then he explodes. I remember Questlove once saying, when Prince screamed on record, you really thought he was losing his mind. You didn't think he was showing off. You thought he was losing his mind. And that makes a visceral connection, I think, to audiences and in people who are deep in their love of music that separates them from people, from artists like Mariah, Whitney, and Celine, where, yes, I know you can hit that big note, but how do you get us there? Is it worth it? I'll always say, I'm a bigger fan of Dolly Parton's version of I Will Always Love You than Whitney's version. And I don't think Whitney's version is bad. That's not to dump on it. It's just that there's a subtlety in it, in a sort of homespun, and this also may be my Kentucky roots coming out, a
Mm.
homespun, heartbroken piece to it that it's not the mall ballad that Whitney turned it into very successfully, and I'm not saying it's bad.
Yeah, and believe Whitney's version of "I Will Always Love You" was produced by Dave Foster,
Hmm.
and knowing how he likes to take things, make it big and
Yep.
grand and polish it, and he also gave us "After the Love Is Gone" by Earth, Wind and Fire, if you didn't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like David Foster, he also did a lot of stuff in Chicago, which was often going for the bigger sound and the tugging at your heartstrings in perhaps maybe the most obvious way, the most direct route. Uh,
Mm.
but you can't deny the skill set, that a David Foster has. I like to say this. There is no band in the history of the earth that I hate more than Styx. But I will never deny that they don't know how to play their instruments. I just don't like what they choose to do with their instruments. You know what I
Right.
mean? I
Mm-hmm.
can't play a kazoo, right? So I know that these guys are more talented than me. I
Mm-hmm.
just wish they would do something more interesting with their talent. And I think, Whitney through, I think she kind of lost her way through drugs, which is well reported. Mariah became very much a studio creation, and so did Celine. And if they push back in a way that they were going, like the last great Mariah Carey song to me is "We Belong Together." That's a great, great song, and it would have been great in any era. But I think the record companies and there's this fascination that you have as an artist that I imagine is that you're always trying to keep up with your last success.
Mm-hmm.
And while that may make you more money, I sometimes wonder if it makes you artistically better.
Right. And Dave Foster, another tidbit, he was originally part of the Canadian band Skylark, who originally recorded Wildflower before the most popular version that I know of was recorded by New Birth.
Yeah, I mean, Foster goes way, way back. His lineage is ridiculous, but I do think he fell into at some point a middle of the road formula. And he kept reproducing it. And God love him. I mean, it served his purposes. And I'm sure he likes those songs. I don't think that he doesn't. I just think that a man with that much talent could have stretched not only himself, but the artists he worked with a little more.
Right, and you mentioned commercial viability versus artistic integrity, and I want to talk about Janet Jackson for a minute and how she had two albums, the self-titled album and Dream Street, great albums,
Yep.
but they didn't have that identity that
Mhm.
she got once she hooked up with Jam and Lewis for Control, which exploded in '86. And of course, AMM saw the numbers that Control was doing and said, we want another one. And she was like, no, I'm not going to do Control 2.
Right.
And that's where we got Rhythm Nation. And then to tie it back to Sly,
Mm.
Jimmy Jam gave the story of how they came up with Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself. The
As their
sample for Rhythm Nation was
yeah.
just randomly
Brilliant.
just out eating and was like, oh, let me get the check. Let me go to flight time.
My favorite song by Janet, actually. I think Janet's first two solo albums were a little too carefully curated. The interesting thing is Joe, her father, was very resistant to having Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis produce her because they were afraid that she was going that they were going to make her sound like Prince,
He
which
didn't
is
want her to be in camisoles like Vandy was in The Walk.
yeah, yeah. And Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis had produced the SOS band, and they had done other things that, may have had some Minneapolis sound. They're obviously very responsible for the Minneapolis sound, but there's multiple versions of the Minneapolis sound. There's Prince's version, there's Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis's, which is very, very percussion and drum heavy. And then there's also the punk space where the replacements Husker Du and Soul Asylum came out of. So, I think Joe, I understand Joe's reticence, but Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis were on their own trip. They weren't on Prince's trip entirely. So I would say Control was what they did with Control was say, Janet, be you and we will form these songs around you, what you want. And Control is by its nature, that title track is very much a statement of wanting to be your own person. And then Rhythm Nation, I think, is easily, and I like a lot of Janet Jackson songs, but easily her best song. That thing explodes every time I hear it. And the sample is part of it, but there is something almost militaristic in terms of the boom, boom,
Right.
boom, that comes at you that
Right.
is just it just has so much power.
Right, and I'm sure Janet was inspired by Michael when he was doing Captain EO for
Yeah.
Disney, because when you look at that and see the militaristic movements and the
Yep.
choreography in the
Yep.
video, and I think Michael probably might have told you that, hey, this may be good for you for your next record.
Hey, and by the way, Scream is a terribly underrated track. Scream is fantastic, in my opinion. With Michael and Janet together, that is a boy. That is it. I mean, that is a song that I think stretched both of them in terms of. I mean, there's almost. I don't want to go this far, but there's almost an industrial edge to that song that I think you don't hear in other parts of their work. There's a real sense of danger that goes beyond the pretend danger of like a Dirty Diana.
Mhm. Now, what's your hopes for the Michael biopic that's going to be dropping? We have Nia Long playing
Uh,
Catherine Jackson, Coleman Domingo playing Joe Jackson, and we got Jafar Jackson, Michael's nephew, Jermaine
yeah.
Jackson's son, playing his uncle. I feel it's probably going to be one of the most scrutinized
Yep.
biopics when it comes out because Michael was such a beloved figure around the world. But I know it's going to be handled with care. They're going to tell it all because you have literally the man's nephew playing his uncle.
Well, one thing I'll say, anything that Coleman Domingo is a part of, you automatically raise your ears up and think to yourself, okay, this could be good, or at least he's going to be good. I mean, that is a good measuring stick. I think the hard part is, are they going to go into the accusations? And if they do go into the accusations around child abuse, how far are they going to go? I think that is a very, very tricky line. And I think the other part that's hard, there's a talk about the Prince Estate doing basically a jukebox musical, on Broadway. I don't know where that sits at now, but you got to find somebody to play Michael and Prince, and not a lot of time has passed since they've died. And I think whoever gets put in that position, it's not like Timothy Chalamet playing Bob Dylan 60 years after Bob Dylan was a known quantity, right? This is like a decade or so. And so people still have very strong impressions in their mind of who Michael, who Prince was, or any other artist of who maybe have passed away in the last 10 years. So, and we're still, very much in the public mind, in the public sphere. So I think it's I wish them well. It is a very, very tall order they're taking on, and I hope they do it with courage
Mm,
and not just give us what's easy, like I want to dance with somebody, which I think
right.
was, um, yeah, I think that was the easy route to take.
Right. And what was your take for you when for you growing up, first hearing rap for the first time and
Hmm.
then seeing it coming and crossing over when we had Vanilla Ice, MC Hammer, DJ Jazzy Jeff, and the Fresh Prince, and then later on to where it's the most beloved genre of music in the world and
Yep.
where folks were once scared to let Snoop Dogg or Ice Cube come into middle America, but
Yeah.
now they're America's sweethearts.
Yeah, I mean, they're. I mean, if you go to a grocery store, it's hard to find something without Snoop Dogg's face on it anymore. I would say, for me, I had heard Rapper's Delight. I thought it was fun. I thought it was enjoyable. The message, I was too young. Like Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, I was too young to understand the message, but I sure as hell liked the way it sounded. And same with White Lines. I would say that my real introduction to hip hop was Run DMC. As a white kid who liked rock and roll, who liked R&B, who liked funk, it was like compressing it all together. There's the documentary series that came out, was it last year, year before, on Run DMC, and there's a quote that Eminem has in there somewhere. And I'm going to butcher it, but I'll do my best shot. But he was talking about how they were a rap duo who finished each other's lines. And no one ever did that before. Usually a rap duo, this person says their line, and then this person says their line. They would finish each other's lines. And then they had that big backbeat, which I think appealed to a lot of white kids, to be perfectly honest. And I always say if Run DMC were white and the Beastie Boys were black, Run DMC would have sold more records than the Beastie Boys. And I love the Beastie Boys. This is not a pushback on them. Where I see hip hop now, I hate to say it, but I feel like Kendrick Lamar aside, maybe Tyler the Future aside, um, you know, God help us, Kanye West has lost his marbles. And look, I'm a person who can separate art from the artist. Um, Kanye's first six albums are incredible. But I think the closer he has gone to the brink of, I don't know if you want to call it insanity or mental issues or
Off the
whatever,
deep end.
off the deep end, yeah. I think his music has suffered too. So if his music was still good, I would say it was still good, regardless of his behavior. I think we're at a point now where I miss the days. God, it's like an old man. I miss the days where hip hop had female rappers who weren't just rapping about their crotch. And I miss the days of like a Public Enemy where, we have that with Kendrick still. I mean, that Kendrick Lamar, I think, is like, I feel like Kendrick must be a very lonely figure in the world of hip hop now. And then there's Big Mike to a degree, but Kendrick is he's peaking right now, and he's got something to say. And the subtle messages, and sometimes not so subtle messages he was sending out in the Super Bowl, were, I think, just kind of astonishing. So
Mhm.
I wish there were more people around Kendrick like Kendrick,
Right.
female or male.
Right. And you mentioned the Beasties earlier and how there were another group that really took a stand on artistic integrity, especially after once License to Ill blew
Mhm.
up, became a big
Yes.
commercial smash. And of course, labels want a License to Ill too, but that was when they had that break from Def Jam. They left Def Jam to go to Capitol and they put out Paul's Boutique, which was creatively avant-garde for them because
Yep.
everybody was expecting them to do another License to Ill because when you listen to License to Ill, to me, it kind of sounds frat house, animal house
Yep.
rap.
And the thing about it is, I think they were making fun of that, but I don't think people got the joke. And part of that's on them, right? Because it was a little too on the nose. But I still enjoy some of those tracks. No Sleep Till Brooklyn, I could listen
Mm.
to every day. But you know what they decided when they did Paul's Boutique is that we're not going to get pigeonholed. And then you go on to like, I mean, when I saw them at Lollapalooza far too many years ago, you got their hip hop. They did funk instrumentals that sounded like they were out of, Shaft or, Superfly. And then you got their hip hop stuff. And one thing I always admired about the Beastie Boys is they never tried to sound like anything other than they were. They just let themselves sound like nerdy ass white guys, from the borough who, loved hip hop and they weren't trying to ride anyone else's train. I think that's why Run DMC's always shown them respect. I think that's why Chuck D's always shown them respect, is because they were creative and they weren't trying to be anything other than what they were.
Yeah, and the one thing hip hop did was took a lot of the mom and dad's old crate record collection,
Yeah,
gave it a boost by saying, we're going to take these old records and sample them. But this was around when the mechanics wasn't there for labels and artists to determine, okay, this is how much you're going to get paid for this sample.
yeah.
This is how much you're going to get paid for this interpolation. And the older artists were feeling like, hey, you're stealing my stuff. You're not paying me. But once they figured out, like, hey, we can make more money off of sampling than us going out on the road to being a Goldie Oldies act, then they were like, okay, we're gonna we like it.
And the older artists are right about that. They should have been getting paid for that. But this is typical of our society. Technology is always ahead of the law, right? Of bills. Technology moves faster than Congress does, essentially, right? And we're seeing this with AI right now, to be perfectly honest. And that is that, there wasn't, I mean, you couldn't get De La Soul's first album on CD for years because of the sample clearances, and it was because that there was nothing in place to state, if you take this bit from this artist, take this beat, take this bass line, whatever, there was nothing in place that said that you had to pay them for that or give them a songwriting credit for that. And I think that was a battle that was rightly fought and won for those older artists because if you are using their music, you should pay them for that. I think that is completely fair. And I think, this is a thing that Prince always believed in. Pay people for their work, right? And so I think that was fair. But I also think if you look at De La Soul's first album and you look at Paul's Boutique, um, the number of samples, I mean, you can't keep up with them. I mean, it's the count, it's extraordinary. But it also pointed to the fact that sampling was a form of creativity in his music too. I know people who believe that if it isn't guitars, bass, and drums and piano, that it's not really music. If you can make a sound, I don't give a shit what you make it with. It can be music.
Right. And another rap label that I feel doesn't get enough credit in order for bridging rap from the underground to mainstream was Delicious Vinyl. Because when
Mm.
you look
Yep,
at the work that they had with 5MC and Tone Loc and how for
yeah.
Wild Things sampling Janie's Crime by Van Halen and on Funky Cold Medina, Hot Blooded by Foreigner, Rock and Roll Hall of Famer, by the way, Foreigner, and how that kind of eased its way into the mainstream because we're putting rock records on top of rap records,
Yep,
which made the rap records more palatable to an audience that
yep,
wouldn't necessarily be watching Video Music Box if you're in the tri-state or Rap City if you had BET in your small podunk Midwest town. And this is probably maybe a year or two before Yo MTV Raps
Yeah,
made
yeah.
its
Look. If
mainstream
anybody,
launch.
if anybody talks to me long enough, I'll probably bring up the movie Heat. And when Tone Loc had his cameo in Heat, I had to like hold myself down from clapping in the theater when I saw him show up. And it wasn't just because of his cool voice and his vibe and all those kinds of things. It was just that those records were revolutionary. I mean, they did bridge that gap, musically, between races, and I think also between, commerce. I mean, look, when MTV first came about, they were barely playing black musicians at all. And if they were, it was like at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know. And I'll never forget David Bowie interviewing Mark Goodman and taking him to task, because David Bowie had just put out Let's Dance, which was a very R&B influenced. I mean, you can hear like on Modern Love, you can hear like the Motown influences and the backing vocals and things like that. And he took them to task in like that, this sort of genteel British man, English way that he did. And he said, I just don't understand why you don't do that, and I don't know how much of an influence it actually had, but it sure as hell couldn't have hurt. And then, the next thing you know, I always like to say, Aerosmith didn't come back. Run DMC saved them because Aerosmith was dead before Walk This Way. They were dead. They could not sell a record worth anything on their own. And then they had that hit, and they got song doctors to come in and help them. I mean, shit, Diane Warren wrote the Armageddon song for him.
Yeah.
So Run DMC saved Aerosmith. Aerosmith did not legitimize Run
Right.
DMC.
So we have Run DMC to thank for Aerosmith for having Revolution X. And
Yeah,
remember, music is the weapon.
always.
That game took all my quarters in the arcade along with Terminator 2 and insert fighting game here. Now, I was never the type to line my quarters up on the cabinet. I knew some kids that did. I always kept mines in my pocket and
Yeah,
always asked, like, hey, can I get in? If they said
right.
no, I'll just circle back until I saw nobody at the cabinet, and then that's when I would make my beeline.
Works that way at
But
the pool hall too.
now the pool hall, I was a little bit too young for the pool hall, but this was before you had the family fun centers where
Yeah.
arcades was looked at as seedy, where you had backroom dealings, and this was back when you could smoke in places, kids. But
Mhm.
you had kids trying to scrounge like Gator and Jungle Fever, looking for money so they can go get quarters to play The Simpsons, Ninja
Yeah.
Turtles, Street Fighter 2, or NBA Jam. Now you wouldn't play the arcade version of NBA Jam because that was going to be $2 off the top if you wanted to play all four quarters.
No, and I know what that's like. I remember, I lived out a little bit out in the country, when I was a kid, and so to drive into town, and the town was 11,000 people, so it wasn't much of a town, but there was one record store, right? So when I say drive, I meant bicycle, so it was a long ride. And the INXS album with Never Tear Us Apart had come out, and I had money to buy it, but I was like, I don't know, 70 cents short or something. So I got back on my bike, went back home, came back very, very sweaty with that extra 70 cents that I probably dug out from my mom's purse, to be perfectly honest. And I came back and I got that record because, the song Need You Tonight is right up there with George Michael's I Want Your Sex is the best Prince songs that Prince never wrote, you know.
So you
So
didn't get caught stealing with the 70 cents like Jane Addiction.
well, I might be caught now if my mom hears this.
Statute of limitations should be up, but this was back when you used to have
True.
to make choices of do I want
Yeah.
to buy this record or do I want to buy that record? Or
Yeah.
when your parents saw the parental advisory sticker on it, they knew,
Oh,
nope, let's go to Kmart, Sears,
yeah.
Walmart, whatever of a big
Well,
box
they
to see if
didn't
they had
have
the
that.
clean version.
Yeah, the funny thing is I remember Don Henley saying, "I'm going to try to put some foul language on my record so I can get that sticker because I know more kids will want my album then." So,
Yeah, and Don Henley, a beast in his own right,
I
drummer,
know, right?
singer,
Yeah,
Eagles, and of course as a solo artist. And just to think about him, and Phil Collins, how both drummers and
Yeah.
then evolved to being frontman, and how that's a hard task to where if you're drumming and singing at the same time because you're keeping two separate forms of time
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you're a drummer and then your vocals is in a whole nother time as well, and you can't get the two mixed because you'll throw everybody off.
My father-in-law is a guitarist and my wife is very musical as well. And if I can throw up a YouTube video of Prince playing guitar, and one of the things that they always note is he's not looking at his hands. And he might be singing, he might not be singing, but either way, he's not looking at his hands. He doesn't need to. There is who was it? Andre Ward, the boxer. He said, there's levels to this,
Mhm.
and there are certain musicians who are on those other levels, where I remember watching Prince on one of the late night shows, and he was playing guitar, and it looked like his fingers were dancing up and down the fret and as if they had little brains inside of each tip, I mean,
Mhm.
that alone was, I mean, if I wasn't, even if what he was playing didn't sound great, which it did, you were this level of accomplishment, this level of musical ability, we can just all kind of stand in awe of it. And I always remind myself, whether I'm writing a film review or a music review or a review about television, that all of these people that I'm critiquing, they do things that I can't do.
Right.
And so I'm coming from a place, I hope, of generosity, and the understanding that I don't really understand what they are capable of.
Right. I was curious, have you ever seen the Sinead O'Connor documentary Nothing Compares?
Yes, yes, it's very good, even though it doesn't include, the Prince song because the estate wouldn't allow it.
Right. And I saw that, and myself being born in 85, only knowing Sinead from Nothing Compares to You
Mhm.
forward, and just knowing her early history
Yeah.
prior to that. And, I know of the Put Your Hands on Me record because of Nightmare on
Oh,
Elm Street part, I believe it was
MC Light.
that was
Yep.
on, which was really the first rap rock collab, female
Yep.
empowerment, and how Sinead was really the one that wasn't going to play the pop game once Nothing
Yep.
Compares to You exploded, and how she stood in solidarity with hip hop when they boycotted the Grammys.
Oh yeah.
Wasn't televised the award. She performed on the stage with the Public Enemy logo shaved in her head. So you knew right there that Sinead O'Connor was a real one.
I remember when she was asked about NWA and some of their lyrics about women and being misogynistic, and she gave this sort of embarrassed little smile, and she said, "Well, some of it's true." I'll just never forget that. And I thought, I mean, here's this, slip of an Irish woman, a whole continent, a whole ocean away. And I was on her tip, when Put Your Hands on Me came out and when Mandinka came out. I think in her case, it's really unfortunate that her career ended not entirely. She made records after that, and many of them were good, but her career as a viable commercial artist ended um, because she was right.
Yeah, and what we're referring to is when she performed on SNL, wore the Bob Marley record, and she had the picture of the Pope, and she tore it up, and she pretty much was telling the truth of what was to later come out of all the abuses that were going on in the Catholic Church, and how she wasn't gonna hold her tongue for nobody.
Nobody.
Commercial success be damned.
No, and she was a child who was abused by nuns. If she is to be believed, and I do believe her, there is a whole history. I mean, if you look into like the Magdalene sisters, young women who got pregnant out of wedlock, they had their babies taken from them, and they were basically stuck. In what amounts to a prison, for the rest of their days and treated with terrible abuse in Ireland. It's an extraordinary story, and I think the only thing that always bothered me about the abuse that she took during that time is that I understand the visceral reaction among Christians and particularly Catholics, but no one, it seemed like no one took the time, and this is the press's fault too. No one ever took the time to ask why. Why did she do it? And if they had, I don't know that it would have changed things that much, but it sure as hell would have at least given her a chance to explain herself.
Yeah, so it almost felt like she was public enemy number one as soon as she did that, and pretty much everybody left her hanging out to dry.
Yeah, except for when because so she was slated to perform at Bob Dylan's 50th 50-year birthday party, I think it was. And she was going to do the song. I believe the song was, oh gosh, it might have been I Want You. It might have been something else. I forget. But she went out there and she was booed mercilessly. And Chris Christopherson, who had performed just before her, RIP to Chris too, he came over to her and he put his head next to hers and he said, "Don't let the bastards grind you down." And you know what Sinead did? She did war again. How tough? How tough do you have to be? And then she left the stage in tears and collapsed into Christopherson's arms. The punishment that she took, I think, way exceeded whatever crime somebody might have thought she committed.
Yeah, and that's the delicate dance when you are a commercial artist, when you put something that takes a stand for something, you're gonna have some pushback, some resistance, and we're gonna tie it back to Motown and with Marvin Gaye,
Yeah,
and to just think how artistically brave it was for him to do what's going on when Barry Gordy, who
didn't
was the
want it.
antithesis of crossover, don't offend,
Yep.
assimilationist, don't rock the boat, and to put something that's going to be so daring out on a label that screams, we're for the youth of young America, the sound of young America, how people are going to take it and be like, we're not going to buy any Motown records because you're saying something we don't like.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I think most people would, I mean, easily tell you that was Marvin's greatest records, what Marvin's greatest album, and I mean on the short list of the 10 greatest albums of all time, most likely. And I think it also probably released Stevie Wonder. I mean, Stevie Wonder's 70s run of albums is astonishing. The places he went, and those were not places he could go with Motown before that. And I think it took Marvin to sort of, you know, break over that barrier. Sly got away with it, not that he was on Motown, but Sly kind of got away with it because the music was so effusive. But Marvin, he made you listen to the words. And when you listen to the words that Marvin was singing back then, I mean, he was talking so far ahead. I mean, in terms of war, in terms of the environment, and in terms of race relations, the courage to have recorded that record, is just, it's hard to believe. And it's even harder to believe they got Barry Gordy to do it, to say yes.
Right. And we were mentioning with Sly earlier about how when Sly came out, black artists were pretty much put in a box where you either had to sound like you were Motown, you had to
Mhm.
sound like Chess, sound like Stax, sound
Yeah.
like King, or any other variation of what R&B was at the time. And Sly pretty much erased all those barriers. But with Motown and Stax in particular, that how I mentioned earlier, Motown was more crossover pop, while Stax was more down home, gritty,
Pretty.
funky soul R&B, and then it crossed pop once Otis Redding performed at Monterey Pop.
But the funny thing about that, it crossed over to pop on its own terms. It didn't bend the knee to
Mhm.
pop at all. I would highly, highly recommend. It was my favorite television show of last year. I wrote it was on my top 10 list that I wrote, but Soulsville, the Stack story,
Oh
uh,
yeah.
is absolutely brilliant. And there's a there's a sequence in there where Otis, and it's black and white. I don't know where they got who was decided to turn the camera on, but thank Lord that they did. But he's doing the Fa 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 song, which is really one of his more minor songs, but he's just kind of playing with it, with the horn section in there. And you just see like this guy working through this song with all this confidence, and people forget Otis wasn't even 30 years old when he died. But he looked like such a grown man, when he was alive, that there's this impression that he, was a gentleman of a greater level of maturity, which he was inside, but not in terms of years. So yeah, I mean, Stax was a real answer to Motown, and it's a shame what happened to Stax, which is, typical of what happens when you get bought by a major label and they decide what they want to do with you. And if you have any pushback, they have the power to, step on you and destroy you.
Yeah, that was the name of the game back in those days, especially when you were a regional label. You
Yep.
necessarily couldn't do it yourself. You needed that backing of a major label to get your stuff out nationwide and pressed and distributed. And you're pretty much, like you said, at the mercy of the majors. I had a chance to go to Memphis some years ago, tour the Stax Museum, and of course, I was in music heaven. But the highlight for me
I bet.
was I got to go to the Reverend Al Green's church, and I lucked
Oh,
out. He was there that Sunday
oh,
preaching, and some of the members who were at the church said, "You guys lucked out because he's out gigging on the road." But he
right.
happened to be there, and of course, there was a bus that pulled up, and people were coming in thinking that was a tourist attraction. Me, being from the South, I knew better. I'm here to get my word and worship and not
I
fan
bet.
out over the Reverend now. But he sounded just like the record. And just to
Yeah.
think about Memphis' contribution to the industry with Stax and later 3 6 Mafia, 8 Ball, MJG, Glorilla, and everything that came out of the Memphis rap scene. And, for 3 6 Mafia winning the Oscar for Best Original
Yeah.
Song for His Heart Out Here off Hustle and Flow, and to just see how, when you look at the regional scenes in music and how even though you have the commonality thread of hip hop, you have your differences based on where you're from, your experiences, because Memphis hip hop is not going to sound like Houston hip hop. Houston
Right.
hip hop is not going to sound like what's out of Southern California. Southern
Yep.
California hip hop is not going to sound like the Bay Area hip hop. Bay Area hip hop is not going to sound like what's come out of Atlanta.
Yeah.
And in Atlanta, hip hop is not going to sound like what's going to come out of Chicago. So each region has its own variances on what their take of hip hop is. And that was the beauty of hip hop expanding outside of the boroughs of New York and getting to other parts of the country and later the world.
And that was one of the saddest things I think about hip hop when it was, I think, at its artistic and close to its commercial peak. I mean, hip hop's still pretty, obviously very commercial, but the East Coast versus West Coast thing, it just seems so terribly unnecessary. Both sides were often, telling stories about the same kind of challenges in life, and often having, the same kind of dance and fun songs. The idea that we have to, the idea that there had to be this competition. And look, in music, there's always competition. In any walk of life, there's always competition. But when you elevate it to a hatefulness in the competition, I mean, there's different kinds of competition, right? The Lakers and the Celtics may not have liked each other, but they respected each other. And I think that respect piece was often missing from the East Coast and the West Coast. And you look at like the Wu-Tang Clan. I mean, Jesus, what a just complete change of the grit and the dirt, that was in that music. And I mean that in the best way. Those and Tupac wasn't exactly coming soft, right? On the West Coast at that time. It was a shame that, these sort of Biggie versus Tupac and all of that had to even be a thing because it just seemed completely unnecessary. And I think between Suge Knight, who, his police record is longer than my arm, and P. Diddy, whose police record is becoming longer than my arm. I wonder if we were dealing with people who didn't who maybe kind of enjoyed the controversy.
Yeah, because it was enough room for everybody to eat. But when you look at that type of
Yes.
environment and the hyper masculine,
Yes.
patriarchal view of there can only be one person on top and we're not eating off the same plate with anybody, that's just going to be one long pissing contest.
Yep. And they were all selling tons of records. It wasn't, nobody was losing from a point of view of sales. Like I said, there's healthy competition and there's unhealthy competition. And I think, Death Row and Bad Boy was unhealthy competition.
Right. And then with competition, I was listening to the R&B Money podcast. It's a podcast with R&B singer Tank and manager Jay
Hmm.
Valentine. They just had L.A. Reid on a couple of weeks
Oh,
ago.
yeah.
And he had always mentioned that, if it wasn't for Jam and Lewis, there'll be no L.A. and Babyface. And
Mhm.
how
Yeah.
whenever they were getting their foot in and wanting to get introduced to Clarence Avant, rest in peace,
Mhm.
and how
Oh,
Jam and Lewis
I-
pretty much opened the door for him, and how they always looked at it as healthy competition, but always knew that Jam and Lewis set the standard,
mhm.
for them. And going relating to Prince once again and the movie Idolmaker, it's a cult classic
Mhm.
for those that don't know.
Yeah.
So it's a movie about a guy who is a songwriter. He knows that, hey, I got these songs that are good, but because of my age and look, I can't do them. So let me
Yeah.
get a face to sing these records so that I can get my stuff out. And I believe I read that that was the inspiration for Prince to do the time and all of the other
Mhm.
spin-off acts to where he can get that extra creative content out to where he won't suffer from overexposure, and two, you
Yeah.
give the illusion that you're feeling all these other acts, but in all actuality, it is me behind the curtain, a la
Right.
Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, and it's funny, one of the most eye-rollingly hysterical stories that I've heard, and it's been confirmed in numerous places, is that when Prince turned in Purple Rain, and they wanted to make a movie at Warner Brothers, the Warner Brothers had the album and they had the movie. They wanted John Travolta to play Prince. Uh,
Ugh, no.
or the Prince character, I should say, which aside from the fact that John Travolta was too old, he certainly couldn't have carried those notes. I mean, John's like an average singer, he's good enough, right? But they were offering up like a $30 million budget if Travolta got to sing the songs and play the part. And Prince, the same 18-year-old kid who said, I'm not taking Maurice White of Earth, Wind, and Fire as my producer. And if you give me another executive producer, I'm basically just going to lock him out of the studio and do my own thing. At 24, said, no, it's either me or nobody, which, standing up to the powers that be at that age is just extraordinary. And so what they did is they gave him what was the so-called black film budget of $6 million to make Purple Rain. And just like he was correct in terms of, producing himself, he was correct in terms that he should have played the part and, sing his own songs. The challenge of, in the Sly video, I'm not, sorry, the Sly documentary, that talk about the challenge of black genius, right? As a white guy, I can only understand it from a distance, right? But I can only imagine turning in a record of that quality and then wanting to attach a movie to it and saying, let's have John Travolta come in and re-record all of this and then play the part. And as a person of your skill level as that Prince had and your level of genius, it's insulting. It's incredibly insulting. And that's not John Travolta is an icon. I don't mean to, put it that way, but it's, he had earned the right. He had earned the right. There was no reason to do it if he wasn't going to play the part.
Mhm. I agree. And, Prince, there's been stories where he would go to other artists and he would say, "Do you own your masters?" And
Yes.
if they said no, conversation ended there. Because
Yep.
Prince was always about dropping jewels on artists on
Yep.
how the game is not really set for you to win. It's like Vegas. The
Yep.
house always
Always
wins.
wins.
And the more that you know about how it works from inside out, then you could have the true leverage and the true power because Prince was all about do it yourself. He was selling his albums on the internet before
NPG.
it
Yep.
became a thing.
Yep.
He was distributing, I believe, musicology in the British newspaper. I think it was the
Yes.
Sunday Mirror, I believe. So he
Yep.
was all about being for the artist, and Michael Jackson was too, because he reverted back the publishing to a lot of those older artists who
Yep.
got screwed out of bad record deals where all the publishing was taken away. And he figured out I'm worth more if I have publishing than going out performing and touring because you can't knock him for taking the jewel that Paul McCartney dropped on him about
Right.
publishing and then
Right.
him turning around buying the Beatles catalog.
Hey, white guys have been buying out black guys' music for a long and black artists' music for a long, long time. There is a reason why Little Richard was doing 150 dates into his 70s. That's because he wasn't making money off of Tutti Frutti, Lucille, and all of the songs that he wrote. He wasn't making any real money off of that, so he had to tour on his name, and that's where he made his money. So, the game is rigged. It's still rigged, but it's a little less rigged because of Prince and Pearl Jam and Tom Petty and George Michael than it used to be. And there's probably a couple of other artists who have, said, "Hell no, I won't go," that I'm leaving out of there. But those are the ones that come to mind.
Yeah, because we have the internet too, because a lot of young artists are learning the information about the business, and you can just do it yourself now to where I
Yeah.
don't necessarily need a middleman to come in, but technically you still kind of do. Because if you're independent, if you don't have the streams, the likes, the impressions, the numbers, you still got to pay to play, baby.
And it cuts both ways, you know. The benefit of the internet and streaming is that you can do it yourself. You can put it out there yourself. And if you catch fire, you could be set for life, right? The other problem though is that streaming income, because once again, technology is almost always ahead of the lawmakers, is that the royalties that you earn from streaming, whether and this goes for Hollywood, this goes for actors and producers and other folks who work in film and television, is nominal compared to what it used to be for your royalties for an album, which weren't that good to begin with, unless you reach the level where you could get to that second record contract.
Yeah, so definitely kids before getting into the game, know your stuff and just pretty much just be in front, be in front, be in front because it feels like with the low bar of entry that anybody could come in. You really have to crank out content, excuse me, almost daily because there's so much out there to grab your attention
Yep.
to where you could just get lost in the shuffle by the second because everybody's doing the same thing you're doing. It feels like we're all one big puppy litter box.
Yeah.
And we have a whole bunch of people that's wanting to pick up the nice shiny puppies out in the front. That's those that have the streams, likes, and impressions. And then we got the runt that's off in the corner that don't necessarily have the views, the likes, the clicks,
Yep.
the impressions. You're pretty much like Wilbur in Charlotte's Web.
The funny thing is that, the two parts here. One, Ethan Hawke recently mentioned that some actors are getting cast based upon how many Instagram followers they have, which makes you just want to throw your head in your hands and go, "Oh my God, is this really where we're headed?" The other part of it, though, is like her, don't like her. That's not even really a factor in the conversation to me. But what Taylor Swift has done from the age of 13 to 35 is absolutely extraordinary. She has stayed at the tip top of the mountain for 22 consecutive years. She has never really faltered. And she controls everything. And when somebody said to her, "No, I'm not going to let you have your masters," she did the most incredible thing that I think I've ever seen in the music industry, which is re-record your own albums and basically tank your original recordings by outselling them every single week with this new record. Now, granted, she was smart and she added bonus cuts and things like that, but she's a clever businesswoman. When people say Taylor Swift isn't talented, or some people start to say Kanye West isn't talented because they don't like him. I always push back against that. If I said, if it's so damn easy, why don't you do it?
Right. And talking about how with the low bar entry, do you think the way of climbing that ladder no longer exists now to where you could get hot in the instant and not really have to grind, toil, and sweat like the days when you actually had to get noticed by somebody?
I think it's harder to have a career. I think that's what it is. If you look at most artists for their peaks, if you get 10 really good years of being a platinum artist, you've really done something. And what those 10 years buy you is nostalgia. And what nostalgia buys you is the possibility of always being able to turn people out at a concert on tour, even if you're not selling records anymore. I think the challenge now is, how do you sustain a career? I mean, is Olivia Rodrigo going to be popular 7 years from now? For her sake, I hope so, but I don't know. We're past the point where it's easy. Like if you look at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominations, and I'm going to write an article on this, but if you look at the Rock and Roll Hall nominations this year, there's not a single first year nominee. They have to go back to find people, because the way the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame works is you have to have been, your first recording has to have been at least 25 years ago. They have sussed through most of the acts who are worthy of consideration, although they should have gotten to Outcast a lot sooner than they have, but that's another story. But they are getting to the point where they're nominating folks like the Black Crowes, who were popular for like 5 years. And no one would consider a game changer, even though they were a good band.
Mhm.
So, the question is there a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that really is relevant in 20 years? Is there a music industry that, you know, has room for more than one Taylor Swift type artist
Right.
20 years from now? I just don't know.
Right. And it feels like when you are an established brand, you have the luxury of being able to put out content
Yep.
when you want to because you know you have your loyal fans that'll wait. But when you're
Yep.
just building and starting, you don't have that luxury. That's why you have to be in front of the face all of the time because everything is moving so fast that we're not going to have that communal artist that everybody loves and listens to. It's not going to be like how 1 out of 3 homes own Thriller. Those days are long gone
Yeah.
where you're now appealing to your niche audience and you're catering as such.
Well, you look at a band like Coldplay, who have definitely, made a career and will always be able to sell out stadiums or large arenas. But years ago, they kind of figured it out when they started having Beyonce and Rihanna on guesting on records, and recently Selena Gomez and BTS, in the effort to stay relevant, right? You just wonder if the era of the Stones, the Aretha Franklins, the U2s, the Michael Jacksons, the Princes, the folks, other than Taylor Swift and maybe Adele, you wonder if there's, I mean, I don't know how much people are going to care about Justin Bieber in 10 years. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. But the artists who matter on a deeper level to people, I think music has become more disposable in part because it's so accessible now. And with
Mhm.
and it cuts both ways. Accessibility is great, right? It's great that you can queue up Spotify or YouTube or whatever and discover a new artist or find a song that you really like. The tough part is the artist can't sustain itself long term if they don't get paid well enough to only be an artist. So the world of garage bands is maybe, not in the place that it should be. And, for a lot of artists who, whether they have a big name or a mid-sized name, if they don't tour, they don't eat.
Yeah, so it's pretty much short game is the way to go now, as opposed to the long game, which is a longevity like a new edition of Rolling Stones or the other legacy acts that can still tour, still sell shows, and you're going based off of the brand of the legacy. And we don't really have the time or space because of technology to build
The
those new
attention
legacy
span.
brands.
Yeah, the attention span. I mean, there are so many, I have said many times that Taylor Swift is the biggest pop artist in history, and people will go, "Oh no, what about the Beatles?" The Beatles had a more of a clear runway. There was not video games, streaming, there wasn't Netflix, there wasn't all of these other forms of entertainment competing for your interest. Then you had to find something to latch onto, and you didn't have 57 channels. You didn't have so many media outlets. You didn't have TikTok, for Pete's sake. And so now I think we're in a position where um you know what does it mean to matter? And does it mean just a series of pop hits? Or does it or is there still space? Because I think right now, more than ever, we could really, really use a Public Enemy. We could really, really use a version of The Clash or Rage Against the Machine in the times that we're living. And I have no idea where that's coming from.
Yeah, we gotta fight the powers that be. And any current projects that you're working on before we get you on out of here.
Uh, yeah, always writing. I'm going to do a piece in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I'm working on a piece, movie wise, for Nora, and yeah, you can find me at the Contending, and I'm pretty prolific. I like to say, if you can't be good, at least be fast. So I do write a lot, and please find me there. And if you like what you read, keep doing it.
All right. Any shout outs you want to give before you close, and also plug where can people find your work?
Yeah, so you can find my work at thecontending.com, and not just my work, but my fellow compadres who are fabulous at covering movie, film, theater, and definitely some music on as well. And then shout outs, I would just say to my wife Maria, who has the best singing voice of anyone I know, and I get to hear it almost every day. Because she doesn't always sing every day, but she will walk around the house singing. To my father-in-law, who has taught me so much about music. He once opened for Sly and the Family Stone in the band that he was in back in the 60s, the Druids of Stonehenge. I know it's a weird name. They had the one record and it didn't sell, so they got dropped. But they ran in some pretty fancy circles for a few years. And then my mother-in-law, who has taught me more about Bob Dylan by the fact that she was his backup singer for 3 years. So yeah, I guess it's my tangential family that I married into that that has over the years taken my interest in music and moved it to a higher level of understanding.
All right. And you can catch this interview wherever you stream podcasts and on the YouTube channel at youtube.com/beyond the album cover. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big thank you to the writer of The Contending, Mr. David E. Phillips. David, thank you for coming on to the podcast, and you're welcome back anytime.
Oh man, total pleasure. Love to come back.
Yes, sir.